It is fantastic to be back here. Do you know this is the first time that we have been back in this space since the first Sunday of March 2020? So thank you. And thank you for everyone who kind of stuck with All Saints and stuck with the forum. And part of what we found during the pandemic is a couple things. First of all, we realized that we could have anyone who could get in front of a computer anywhere on the planet in the forum. And so while we are always going to want to have, like our guest this morning, amazing people who can come and be with us physically, we've also learned that we can globe-trot, we can hop around the globe and get really amazing people in here from all over the country and all over the world. And that's going to be the case next week, when our primary speaker, and I want to get her name right, is Professor Linda James Myers, and she is a really amazing psychologist. She specializes in psychology and culture, moral and spiritual identity development, healing practices at intersections of race, gender, and class at Ohio State University. And she will be joining us virtually, and we'll have a chance to interact with her. The other thing that we learned, which we kind of already knew, was that the old forum used to go from 10:15 to 11, and it just always felt rushed. We had amazing people here, and it just never felt like we got to spend the time we needed to. And then when we expanded it to an hour when we were on Zoom, it felt like we could breathe and it felt right. So that's why we're trying on the change of, instead of having the next service start at 11:15, having it start at 11:30. And we're going to have really a little more time just to be together. Another thing that we're trying on, and we've had a really great team. Bill Deverell is here, who's been working on this team. Monique Thomas, Thomas Diaz, Brunel Anderson, Jillian, a dear friend of ours who's in Philadelphia, is sort of representing the online community. We've really been looking at how can we try some new things with the forum. One of the things that we talked about is we would have amazing speakers in here, and they would talk, and we might be able to have some back and forth with each other. But then we never really got to interact together. And we were always kind of on to the next thing. And so part of what we're going to try on over this month and perhaps the next several months, and we're going to want to hear from you about how you feel about it, is first of all, having some themes tie several Sundays together. We're starting that off this time by really taking the month of October and looking at the idea of public health. And we're breaking it down into sort of those component terms. And so today, and I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, we're really going to look at the idea of public. What does it mean that we're not just individuals, that we are connected with each other? Certainly COVID has highlighted that in new ways. What is the history of that as an American people and a culture? Where have we struggled with that? How has that developed? And then next week, Dr. Myers is going to help us look at that idea of health. What does it really mean to be healthy? Does it just mean to be free of disease? What are the markers? What are the barriers? Is there a relationship between physical health, spiritual health, financial health, emotional and mental health? What do we mean when we talk about health? And then the third week, we're really going to put those two things together and say, okay, with what we've been talking about public and what we've been talking about health, what do we mean, or maybe what could we mean when we talk about public health? And one of the people who's going to be with us is Sherry Bonner from Planned Parenthood of Pasadena and San Gabriel Valley to talk about public health from that perspective that really kind of touches more. And then the fourth week, we're going to try something new, which is really we're going to spend the time having some conversations with each other and see how that goes and say, okay, with everything that we've learned and are learning, what does that mean for All Saints Church? What does that mean for you? What does it mean for your family and your community of friends? And then the second piece of that is, at the end of this session and of each session, we're going to have some questions. And so make sure you don't leave. And if you're online, we're going to be putting these online for you to have them. And they're questions for conversation. And we're going to always have 3 questions. 2 will be about what we've just heard, and 1 will be about looking forward to next week. And you are welcome to stay in this space and gather together in whatever size group you want to and use those for conversation. If something has sparked your imagination about what has been said today, to use those then. You're also welcome, take them home. Use them for conversations with family and friends or just to ponder by yourself. We're really hoping the forum can become more and more something that kind of stays with us all week, but that also sparks conversation and learning, not just from one person talking, but from conversations among ourselves. So, and then as we go through this, we're going to be coming back to you and saying, well, what do you think? Is this working for you? What ideas do you have? As I've said before, this whole year, we're going to spend a lot of time trying stuff on. And such a huge important part of that is your feedback, both those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are joining us online. Because another thing that we learned during COVID is we have an amazing community of All Saints Church that is not just scattered around the Los Angeles Basin and Southern California, it's literally all over the country and all over the world. And we want to more and more find ways to come together as that community. So I am going to stop talking about announcements and things like that and framing and just get us to our topic and the speaker that we are so blessed to have today. I want to introduce to you Peter Mancall. Peter is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the Humanities and Professor of History and Anthropology at USC. He is the author of 7 books. Some of these have great titles. Fatal Journey, The Final Expedition of Henry Hudson, A Tale of Mutiny and Murder in the Arctic. That should be like a Netflix series. Yeah. Nature and Culture in the Early Modern Atlantic, The Trials of Thomas Morton, an Anglican lawyer, his Puritan foes, and the battle for a New England. He's going to talk a little about that. He's currently writing a book called American Origins, which will be volume 1 of the Oxford History of the United States. 2019, 2020, I guess just when COVID started, you were the Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford. His work has appeared in Time, The Wall Street Journal, and American Heritage, and has been featured on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and NPR's All Things Considered, which is probably the best kudos you can probably get in today's society. Peter is with us to really help dive into that word public. And I think you don't want to hear me talk about Peter, you want to hear from Peter. So Peter, welcome to All Saints. Great to have you here.
Do I need to hold the mic? Is that? Oh, okay. This will be good. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I am so honored to be speaking here today. And I want to thank, of course, my good friend Bill Deverell for inviting me here. I mean, it's just a huge honor for me. A week ago, I was in Northern California talking about Thomas Morton in a talk that the title I got from my wife, Lisa Patel, here, called Bad Pilgrims. Today is going to be a little bit different from that. Before I get going, let me tell you what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to start with reading very briefly from a very famous American sermon. And then it'll be sort of a short version of New England history, because I wanted to approach this idea of the common good with a very specific historical example. And I am a historian primarily of 16th and 17th century North America. And so what I want to talk about is that what I know best, and I think it opens up things, because even though that's a population very removed from us and very removed from the majority of the population, the issues that they wrestled with are actually sort of foundational to human societies, and I think important for us today. And just a brief footnote, I usually talk about the Pilgrims and Puritans in November, because that's, of course, Thanksgiving, but just in case you don't know it, this year is the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving. It wasn't last year. It is this year. We can talk about Thanksgiving as a holiday, but let me start by going into a sermon that I imagine you know. I'm 100% certain that you know one piece of this sermon, but this is a model of Christian charity, John Winthrop. And Winthrop allegedly wrote this as he's coming over on the Arbella, going to Massachusetts. And if you remember your New England history, I'll go over this in a minute, the Pilgrims had arrived in 1620 as sort of a subset of this larger group of English Puritans. And the Puritans are going over in 1629 and then found Massachusetts in 1630. In the course of setting up what they're going to do, and this, when religion is so central to what they're going to do, he gives this sermon. Again, this is from a model of Christian charity, which I'm going to read two brief parts. Okay? And again, this is, I hope, to get at the theme of the common good. He's talking about the work we have at hand. It is by a mutual consent, through a special overvaluing providence and a more than ordinary approbation of the churches of Christ, to seek out a place of cohabitation and consortship under a due form of government, both civil and ecclesiastical. In such cases as this, the care of the public must oversway all private respects, by which not only conscience but mere civil policy doth bind us. For it is a true rule that particular estates cannot subsist in the ruin of the public. That is, if you're out just for yourself, the society will collapse. Okay? Now, the most famous portion of this sermon, and then I'll turn away from Winthrop for a little while. For this work, for this plantation to succeed, we must be knit together in this work as one man. I apologize for the gendered language of the 17th century. Knit together as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and our community in the work, our community as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, good, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we've been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England, crucial line, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of the enemies to speak evils of the ways of God and of all professors for God's sakes. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. Okay? Many Americans, especially those of us in California and anyone who was around when Ronald Reagan was president, will know this line about a city on a hill. It is one of the defining lines of sort of American public culture. But it's typically taken out of context as America was obviously going to succeed. We are going to be this great shining beacon for the entire world. But as Winthrop points out, a city on a hill is a place that everybody can see. The world will be looking at what the English, what the Puritans would be doing. And so it comes not just as, it's not a boast, it's a warning. If we are only out for ourselves in this place, which to them is a new place, then we will fail. And not only will we fail, we will be dishonored to God and undermine our, as the Puritans, religious purpose. It distills the idea of what the Puritans have in mind. Okay, that sets us up. Okay, now, I have spent my career really analyzing encounters between Europeans and Native Americans. And so when I read these texts, I don't read these texts perhaps as Winthrop's intended audience. I read these texts as what insights can we gain about encounters, but always bearing in mind, crucially bearing in mind, that when these English or when Europeans generally talk about going into a new world, it is of course a place that is already fully settled, a place that is densely settled, with communities every bit as sophisticated as European communities, though very different in their orientation, but not radically different in the sense that they were heathen or irreligious or pagan. These are deeply religious communities that these religious migrants are coming into. They have very different visions of what religion is. Religion is I'm not sure the right word. They have very different religions, very different views of what the divine is and the manifestations of the divine and how one should see it. And those differences come up time and again and feed some of the tragic encounters that take place. So I'm about to turn to the Pilgrims, but before I turn to the Pilgrims, just 45 seconds of American history. I'm sure you know this, but I just want to remind you. Columbus, as you know, crosses the Atlantic in 1492. If you pick up an American history textbook, a U.S. history textbook, it sometimes skips from Columbus to Jamestown, which is 1607, the founding of Virginia. As a reminder for you, there's a lot of activity during the 16th century of Europeans coming over to North America, and not just going to North America in general, but actually going to New England well before the Pilgrims arrive in New England. And some of the things that happened during that period before 1620 are very important for what happens after 1620. And one of the things that happens before 1620 is there's a terrible epidemic. So this seems an apt time to be talking about this. A terrible epidemic that races through coastal New England, what we would think of now as coastal New England, these Algonquin-speaking communities. We have very poor public health statistics for the 17th century, but the estimate, we have a number of estimates, is that this epidemic, within 3 years, might have reduced the population by 90%. Some communities entirely disappeared. Now, we don't have exact numbers, but there's reporting after reporting. And I'm going to come back to this epidemic in a few minutes. So this is a terrible thing. We could talk about what I think it is. The documents are somewhat ambiguous on this point. But there's this epidemic, and there's a lot of suffering. Okay? 1616 to 1619. Okay? 1620, the Pilgrims arrive. These are people who are Pilgrims are sort of a subset of Puritans. And I'm speaking in this wonderful church, and I feel like I don't mean to make a joke here, but preaching to the choir. But just as a reminder, the Puritans were really strict Calvinists. They really believed in predestination, so they thought that everything that happened was the unfolding of a divine plan. And so whenever we read their texts, we need to bear in mind that this is their general approach to the world. Because if we forget that's their approach, we see things in their text which was not their intention. So everything is the unfolding of a plan. Okay. So 1620, the Pilgrims come over. This epidemic has just happened. They go to this area, which had been settled. We know it was settled. Europeans knew it was settled because Champlain had come through 15 years earlier and drew the area where Plymouth is. And you see this basically small farming community there on the shores of what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts. So there's no doubt that there are people there. But the Pilgrims show up, and their great leader and historian is William Bradford. And Bradford wasn't supposed to be the governor of Plymouth, but he quickly becomes the governor because the other guy passes away very quickly. So Bradford comes in, and he is their governor for much of the first couple of decades. And around 1630, about 10 years after, just around the time that the Puritans are arriving, slightly north of Massachusetts, Plymouth, a little south of Boston, the Puritans arriving in Boston, Bradford sits down to write the history of this place. And this is the book, a very famous book, that we call Of Plymouth Plantation. Right? And it's a book that is well worth reading. Actually, it wasn't in print for a long time. It's been in print since the middle of the 19th century. It's really an important text. Bradford writes about the arrival of the Pilgrims. He takes note of the fact that there had been this epidemic earlier. And in his way of writing, in which everything is the unfolding of a divine plan, the epidemic happened to them, happened to the native peoples. And when Bradford shows up, when Bradford shows up and writes about this, he tries to reimagine what it was like. So I'm doing some of this from memory, so I'll be slightly off in the phrasing. But basically, he writes in there that the Pilgrims arrived in what he called a wilderness, right, which we know wasn't the case because we know it was a settled landscape. He calls a wilderness, into thick woods, and then one of his lines, full of wild beasts and wild men, and what multitude of them they didn't know. Wild beasts and wild men, right? Right. Now, the English had already seen pictures of this place, drawings of this place, that show that this is not the case. But this is the rhetorical convention. And Bradford is setting the scene of this sort of mission into this wilderness to create what they think of as a new godly society. And in one of these memorable moments in the opening of a plantation, opening the American section, memorable moments, he's always referring to Scripture. He says basically, we looked around and there's all these thick forests. And we couldn't find anything like Pisgah, the mountain where Moses ascended to see the promised land. There was nothing like that. So all we could do is look up to God. Right? This is how he sets it off. So he sets off this very dramatic, we've entered into this place. We need God. We will do God's bidding. So during the 1620s with the Pilgrims, then in the 1630s, the Puritans arrive. More and more of these English dissenters, these are people who dissent from the Church of England and come over to create a new society. Among the people that come over, we have this sense that, we don't need to have this sense. If you get the New Yorker, I've always thought there should be a great book, the New Yorker book of Pilgrim cartoons. I will guarantee you that next month there will be at least one Pilgrim cartoon. And I will almost guarantee you that that Pilgrim cartoon will show people either going to church, because they are always going to church, or it will show them and it'll be wintertime, because it is always wintertime, and it will show them as being killjoys because they never had any fun. Because the New Yorker humor, like Mencken's humor, is that the Puritans, spent all their time being awake, fearing that somewhere, someplace was having a good time, right? So this is our stereotype of the Puritans. Okay. Well, it turns out that in 1624, 1625, an Anglican, a lawyer named Thomas Morton, goes over and sets up in a little trading camp, little up from Plymouth, which had been called Marymount, a view of the sea. And he's a fairly happy-go-lucky guy, I guess you could say, and he has a very different vision than the Pilgrims and Puritans. And he sets up a maypole. So if you know what a maypole is, right? These are things that we tend to think are very, very festive. He sets up this maypole, and he starts to dance around it. And he dances around it with some of the local Algonquian-speaking peoples, and he seems to provide them alcohol, and he seems to provide them guns. And this really angers and upsets the Pilgrims. And so the Pilgrims come in, and they go and they arrest Morton, and they send him back to England. So as one of my lines about Morton is that Morton has literally one of the great cameos in American history, where he comes in, dances around the maypole, and then leaves again. But Thomas Morton was not so easy to get rid of. Thomas Morton, the Pilgrims all thought, we got rid of him, and Bradford goes on about how much he hates Thomas Morton. Morton comes back, and this time he goes to Massachusetts. Now John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts, they said, he's a terrible guy, we have to get rid of him. He gets into a theological dispute with the people in Massachusetts. So they get rid of him. He goes back to England. When he's back in England, he writes a book. The book is called New English Canaan, this new place for this new Holy Land. And the Puritans in England suppressed the book, so it doesn't appear for a few years. And Morton, who's a lawyer, gets involved with a group of other English people, non-Puritans, including one named Ferdinando Gorges. And Ferdinando Gorges believes that Ferdinando Gorges, owns New England. And so Thomas Morton works with Ferdinando Gorges to prosecute a legal suit, which actually reaches its way up to the King's Bench, kind of the highest court in England, and they win. And Massachusetts is supposed to give up its charter. But the people of Massachusetts know they're 3,000 miles away, and they basically say, nope, we're not going to do that, and life sort of goes on. In 1637, two things happen. Morton's book comes out, and a terrible war breaks out in New England. It's a war that we call the Pequot War. And there are very vivid descriptions of this war, including by William Bradford. And basically, the most horrific point of this war is that the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who in England had some slight theological differences, but in New England are complete allies, they are convinced that the Pequot Indians are going to rise up and kick the English out of New England. And so the Puritans and Pilgrims make an alliance with the Narragansetts, who are also in the area. And at the dramatic point of this war, they surround a village on the Mystic River, and they set it on fire, and they shoot the people who are coming out. And it's a depiction, it's this horrible depiction of this massacre that takes place. When I said before, it's important to read the Puritans in context. Bradford describes this, and he basically said, this is God's will. And this has been taken out of context for a long time as suggesting that the Puritans and the Pilgrims intended to commit genocide of native peoples in North America. Now, there's a lot we can talk about this, but set in their context, what Bradford was trying to say was that these were, as he put it, a proud and insulting enemy of God, and so we did this to them. To them. That same year, Morton's book comes out. And I'm just going to read you one brief paragraph. Sorry. Okay, so Morton in his book, he also writes a history of New England. And this is his part describing that epidemic of 1616, 1619. So remember, he wrote this book in 1632. It didn't come out. It comes out in 1637, the same year as the Pequot War. But when he writes the book, he doesn't know this war had taken place. He's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But he does remember this epidemic. And this is what he says about the epidemic. The hand of God fell heavily on these Algonquin-speaking peoples, with such a mortal stroke that they died on heaps, and as they lay in their houses and the living, that were able to shift for themselves would run away and let them die, and let their carcasses lie above the ground without burial. He notes that there were few survivors. He continues. The bones and skulls upon the several places of their habitations made such a spectacle as I traveled, as I worked in that forest near the Massachusetts, that it seemed to me a newfound Golgotha. Now, there are a lot of places where I would read that and people would not catch the reference to Golgotha. In this crowd, I'm sure you know what that refers to. But the important thing to me here in reading Morton and in reading this is that when you read the Puritan and Pilgrim texts, this epidemic unfolds, and it seems to be the working out of God's will on native peoples. Morton, by likening this to Calvary, sees instead this tragedy as a moment of a shared, painful human past. We are all in this together in some sense. It's not them versus us. It is something that we need to all do. I emphasize this point. Morton, by the way, then comes back to New England. The Puritans had exiled him. He comes back a third time. They exile him a third time. And he goes to Maine and he dies. I have a whole book about that if you want to read more about Thomas Morton. But I'm going to shift away from Morton to sort of bring this now into the context of really one of the central points of Puritan New England, which is they're supposed to look out for one another. And how does one define the bounds of that community? Who is the us? Right? What is the community? What is the common good? Because I will tell you that even though you can read the Puritan texts, and a lot of English texts and a lot of European texts, as seeming to suggest that they celebrate the destruction of native peoples, in the 16th and 17th centuries, if you read those same texts, they normally also talk about the impulse and the importance of converting and Christianizing native peoples. Now, we could have a big debate about what it means when you go somewhere and say your religion and culture are inferior, ours is better, and you need to change your ways. That is a huge point that I've spent a lot of my career talking about and would be happy to talk about. But in point of fact, as I have maintained to my students for years, that is very different from our modern conceptions of genocide. So just worth putting that out there. Okay, so let's take Morton off. The Puritans are here. The Puritans win, in some sense. They win, right? The Pilgrims in Plymouth don't do so well. Not too many people want to go there. There are actually some years that Plymouth does not even have a priest, a minister there. That's how sort of unpopular Plymouth was. But Massachusetts thrives. And Massachusetts then spawns all these other communities, which then create the modern, colonies ultimately of Rhode Island and Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, and then have this enduring legacy in American culture. Okay? Winthrop said, we've got to work for each other. If we work for ourselves, we fail. Okay. They have managed to sort of push Native peoples out of the way to be able to create their own community by the late 1630s. So we said to ourselves, okay, this is a great natural experiment. What happened, right? What happened when you're no longer fighting with the Church of England, you're no longer fighting with the Algonquin-speaking peoples, you can now create your own sense of community. Do you all just go out and do it for yourselves, or is there really a sense of community? Well, this is a hard sort of thing to judge in the 17th century. It's probably hard for us to judge in today's world. But in the 17th century, there are a few markers which I think are worth thinking about. One, this is going to seem incredibly obscure, but a really remarkable document. In 1653, a Boston merchant named Robert Kane, who had been a greatly respected member of his community, been a selectman, a member of the church. We're not automatically a member of these Puritan churches. We can talk about that if you want. But a member of the church, men in high respect, writes a 50,000-word last will and testament. Now, I don't know if you've written your last wills, I don't know, but I'm doubting that they're 50,000 words. I could be wrong. Why does someone write a 50,000-word will? Because Robert Kane was upset that the Puritans running Boston at the time had kicked him out of his position as a selectman for what they deemed the crime of trying to go out on his own to make money and not doing things for the good of the community. What had he done? He was a merchant. He sold a bag of roofing nails for like 4 pence instead of 2 pence. Right? Somebody complained. And then somebody else complained. He charged me too much for a saddle. He charged me too much for a coat. And the figures there, this is a place where they intended church and state to be integrated, not separate. That's a later American notion. They basically said, he's out for himself. This is not what God had in mind. And so they go after him, and then he responds, basically saying, I am as good a Christian, a Puritan, whatever you want, as you, and he writes this last thing. His will, which was found in Massachusetts in the archives, is a sign of how difficult it is to create a community, because here is someone who, after all, was central to the community, who then, over what we would think of as an incredibly petty dispute, gets kicked out. Right? What is going on? Fast forward 9 years. 9 years. You might recall, depending on how well you know New England history, there was something called the Halfway Covenant. Halfway Covenant was are you familiar with this concept? I don't know. Okay. Oh, well, boy, we're going to get into some deep theology. I'm going to make this very brief so we can get into the question and answer if you want. In brief, the Puritans and the Pilgrims believed that a church should be a gathering together of those God had chosen for salvation. But they don't believe that God spoke to people individually. So how would anyone know whether they were saved? Well, they had these elaborate rules, elaborate ways of doing it. And I don't know your policies at this church, but I'm guessing, I could be wrong, I'm guessing that if someone moves to Pasadena and says, I want to join All Saints, that they don't have to go to the front of the church, sit on a bench, and be interrogated by the community to see if their faith is correct. Right? Now, you might do that, and if so, well, okay, I want to come watch. But I'm guessing you don't. But they did in the 17th century. And the first generation that came over, these English Puritans, were real believers. And so, of course, they all became church members, right? Because they had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They'd gone from London and Leiden and these urban places. They all believed that and so they had these various signs. But their children, not so much. And the children of the migrants didn't think it was worth it to become a full member of the church. So many of them didn't. And sometimes you could say, well, whatever, we can live with that. But then those children started to have children by the middle decades of the 17th century. And now the churches had a real problem. Because one of the things that churches did then, I assume you still do here, is baptize infants. And in that world, in their world, if an infant was unbaptized and passed away, and infant mortality is high in this 17th century, right? If that child is not baptized, that child cannot be saved, right? And so the people running the church try to figure out, well, we can't interrogate an infant to see whether they have saving grace, and their parents didn't offer themselves up, but their grandparents did. So what do? We don't want to get in the way of God. So they come up in 1662 with this thing called the halfway covenant, where they do baptize these infants as sort of a down payment. We'll baptize you, but, no communion, nothing else until you become a full member of the church. It was a halfway membership. It was a compromise among a people who don't like to compromise. Okay? Another sign of these tensions. By the middle decades of the 17th century, I'm going to come to a close here so we can talk. By the middle decades of the 17th century, other things are going on in New England, things that seem unusual, things that seem not very godly to people. And beginning in the 1660s and picking up a little bit of speed, Puritans in New England come to believe that some of their neighbors are witches. That is, they're in league with the devil. Most of those who they accused of witchcraft were women who were older, who were single, and often didn't have much money. And in all of these categories, they were far from the centers of power in this community. And these accusations go back, culminate, as you know, in Salem in 1692. And in 1692, there is this mass event which leads to a number of executions and a lot of dysfunction in the government. And eventually, by the mid-1690s, things start to come together. And historians, though they debate it, but I would be among the historians who would say that Puritan impulse to create a society where you would emphasize the common good instead of that of the individual essentially is gone. Because one of the legacies of that, we have to take care of each other, was this pressure to look at and investigate your neighbors. And so when they were doing something that you thought didn't fit in God's path, then that was a danger sign, and you persecuted them. In the history of American Protestantism, an area that you know much better than I do, in New England, this then sets up the next great stage, which would be Jonathan Edwards and other people, and having an entirely new vision of what Protestant faith is supposed to be in America in the 18th century. But it's no longer based as much on the idea of this common good as a community so tightly wound, and it instead becomes a range of religious practices that become very adaptable to American society as it develops across the 18th, 19th, 20th, and into the 21st centuries. So to bring this back, and then we'll talk. I hope this has been about the right amount of time. We ask this question. Here was this religious idea, and here was a situation where you'd think this could work, and it doesn't. And so people now go back and look at the Puritans, and they see other things about the Puritans, other things about the colonists in the 17th century. Like these are people who sort of started this streak of what becomes American individualism and help plant the seeds of what becomes the market economy as we understand it. These are things that Winthrop and Bradford would not have wanted to happen, but they happen, and it's for us to make sense of it. So I think with that, well, I'll come and talk to you, and so thank you.
I want to, just make sure. First of all, just thank you. There's so much, and I want to open this up to you all. For folks who are watching us and participating online, want to make sure if you have a question, you can use our text number, and that's 910-TEXT-ASC, which is also 910-839-8272, 910-839-8272. I could have a ton of questions. I just want to ask maybe one and a half, and then I really want to open it up to everyone. And Bill, if you could maybe grab this so people can ask questions and jump in with anything that you have. First of all, thank you so much, because part of why we wanted you to come here is, as been said so many times, past is prologue. And if we want to understand how we got to how we are, we need to go back and look at some of these roots that you have given us. To go back to just the beginning of what you said in John Winthrop and that sermon, which was, I don't know about anyone else, but I had never heard it framed that way. I had heard it framed in the Reagan way, of the city on the hill being this triumphal image. And what you said is it's a place anyone can see. It's a warning. And that if we're out only for ourselves, we will fail and dishonor God. And so, part of what I just love for you to reflect on right now with your knowledge of John Winthrop is, what would John Winthrop, looking at America as, would John Winthrop say, yes, America is a city on a hill today? And what do you think, based on what he had wanted, that he would say? Would he say that this, yes, it's a city and it's a failed project? What do you think Winthrop would say if he could see us today?
So that's a great question. And I will probably have not a great answer, but my sense is that John Winthrop would be very unhappy with what he sees in modern America. I can't be sure, but there's one thing I know he'd be unhappy about. John Winthrop, in his role as governor of Massachusetts, twice exiled Thomas Morton in his role as governor. In 2011, the governor of Massachusetts then, Deval Patrick, declared Thomas Morton Day. Because Thomas Morton, by the 21st century, stood for American values more than the Puritans did. The American, or sort of aspirational values of being kind to people who are not like yourself, of respecting nature. There's a whole part of Morton's book where it's this glorious description of the environment of New England, and of sort of celebrating a sense of community that is not overly restricted. They still dance around the maypole in Quincy, Mass. They might not this year, but they have historically been dancing around. So I think Winthrop would have been somewhat appalled that a miscreant like Morton could be celebrated. But I think more than that, I think they would have, we study history for a lot of reasons, and a lot of us have different views about why we do that. Even professional historians have different views about why we do that. I think that we do it to learn things from the past, but the past is not going to repeat itself, although there are people who do think there are these cycles in history. I'm not one of them. But I think by the time, as things progress from the early 17th century onward, things happen within New England which Winthrop did not anticipate and would not have celebrated, but would not have known how to restrain. So I'll give one example, because it's an easy sort of example to realize. When the Pilgrims and the Puritans come over, and what I emphasized when I was talking is their religious mission. I talked all the time. But they lived in a real world. They accrued debts to pay for their travel across the Atlantic Ocean. And if you know New England, I don't know how many of you are from New England or have ancestors in New England. New England is not the most agriculturally fertile part of what is now the United States. So the way to make money in New England was through the fur trade. And the way to make money in the fur trade was to form alliances with indigenous hunters so that they would bring you furs. Because natives knew how to find the most valuable furs much more readily than the colonists did. So they form these relationships. And they start to pay native peoples in goods that native peoples want. And that's a whole complicated thing, but basically. And so native peoples, to get these goods, start to bring in more beaver and other animals. But beaver is the crucial animal at the time. Before Europeans had arrived, native peoples, and I don't mean this to sound like a sort of a stereotype, but native peoples primarily really lived in great harmony and balance with nature, and would never have overhunted any specific species, because that would have cast things out of balance. Now, we can see the ecological advantages of that way of living. There's a reason why you want beavers around, because they help maintain watersheds, right? But they had this other way of doing it. But when the forces of the market come in, and native peoples' populations have thinned because of epidemic disease and because of warfare, and what I didn't mention also, there are colonists who were capturing and enslaving and shipping some natives in New England to the West Indies to be enslaved. They start to overhunt beaver, especially. So by 1650, which Winthrop is still, these people are still around in 1650, the migrants, beaver are basically gone from much of southern New England. They're gone. So they have, within a single generation, created this sort of ecological catastrophe. And a very well-known environmental historian, who's a friend of Bill Deverell and a friend of mine, named William Cronin, who's at the University of Wisconsin, wrote a very influential book in 1983 called Changes in the Land, where he basically said that on the one hand, the colonists said they would coexist with the natives, but on the other hand, the colonists' economic drive undermines the way to do things together, and ultimately creates tensions. Winthrop couldn't have seen it from that perspective, but Winthrop has this idea that there will be these small communities, and they will sort of be planted, and then they will exist for generation after generation. One thing that he didn't anticipate about the environment of New England, that none of the Europeans anticipated, was that New England in the 17th century was probably one of the healthiest climates in human history. And we know that because there's very small numbers of infants who passed away. When I talk about the Halfway Covenant, that was their fear from the old world. But in point of fact, the average Pilgrim Puritan family probably had 10 kids in it. And the vast majority of them make it to age 21. And if you make it to age 21 in the 17th century, chances are you're going to make it into your 50s or 60s. And not only did people make it to their 50s and 60s, there are records of people making it to their 90s, to 100. So it's an incredibly healthy thing. Winthrop, like Bradford, had an idea about how a community should form. They had no idea what would happen when the population would naturally expand so quickly, which it did with all of these children. And that created all of these other pressures, including pressures of colonists going further out into what Bradford had called a wilderness, putting more pressure on the native peoples who remain in New England to take their land away, further weakening relations between them, and then leading to behavior which over time seems to become yet more individualistic. So I think that had Winthrop lived to be 130 or 120, he would have been very disappointed at what he'd seen. But that's my read of it, and it's a counterfactual.
Thank you. I've got like 5 different places I could go, but I want to see what are the questions. John, go ahead.
Okay. So, number one, thank you so much for the presentation. I am a New Englander, and I had relatives in Salem who were murdered, Malleus Malefactum and all that. So, but what I heard from your talk was a progression from an emphasis on community to ultimately not working. An example is the witch trials, to then individualism, and now here we are, and that's not working. So do you see a cycle? And if you do, is there a way to break it? Because I don't think by the time the witch trials occurred, we really were in community. I think that was all individualism as well, the part of the transition period. But that's my opinion. So do you see a cycle, and is there a way you see we can break it?
That is a great question. And we could talk forever about Salem, but I'm not going to talk about Salem. I should say, if anyone wants to follow up this conversation, just email me, and I'm happy to always talk about 17th century New England. But this question about this sort of move into individualism. The Puritans would say a descent into individualism. I don't want to use that word, but a move into individualism. What I'm about to say might seem like a strange comment. Like, I'm just thinking this now, so I stipulate. We live in a society which seems so highly, obsessively individualistic, right? So narcissistic, right? Where, all of our thoughts, if I have a thought and I can capture it in 140, 280 characters, then I should share it with the world instantaneously. And then that is a highly individualized thing. Here's the thing. This might sound crazy. I was living in England. Lisa and I were living in England in the spring of 2019, right, when the pandemic began. You said this is our first meeting back here. For your first meeting back in this space. Many terrible things have happened during that pandemic. Many tragic things about the loss of so many people that we know. Right? But something else has happened during that, and that is that the world has been a community again at trying to find a solution to the most pressing problem of our time. And just put that in sort of contrast with, say, so my family, so I'm Jewish, so put that in contrast to, say, the Holocaust, right? The world didn't come together and say, here is a specific problem. People in the world came together and said, this is a problem and we should do something about it. This problem that we're facing now, this public health problem, the pandemic, people from all sorts of different societies and cultures have put many of what we think are our best minds working together, sharing information, and coming up with, I don't mean to make a political statement, vaccines.
You're on safe ground.
Okay, I'm not trying to make up, anyway, that have enabled us to now see that through this common work, we are going to get back to something approaching normal again. Now, maybe, I don't know what explains that, and maybe you could say, well, that's not about a sense of community, but I think deeply it is, because one of the things that the pandemic has done is it's revived the notion of public health. Because the American medical system has not been historically about public health. If there are any physicians in the room, my father and brother are doctors, so anyway, but it's been about individual care. Public health is now very much on our minds. We are sitting here in this building wearing masks, not to protect ourselves, but to protect each other. Right? That strikes me as a very deep and profound sense of community. So I think in some sense, while I emphasize growing individualism in New England, which I do think happened, I think that there are these strains of sort of communal things, a sense of the common good, which maybe too often lurk beneath the surface. And maybe it needs a crisis to bring it out, but I do think that that capacity is still there. Not in the way that the Puritans had in mind, where I would come to your house and investigate everything you do to decide, are you acting in a godly way, and if not, kick you out. Because the people I talked about, the sense of community, they didn't just kick out Thomas Martin. They kicked out Anne Hutchinson. They kicked out Roger Williams. They kicked out a lot of people who would think were just like them, but whose interpretations of Scripture differed in some ways. Right? So I think that there's this tension between individualism and a sense of community. So I'm saying I think there's some. I went on a bit, but that's my...
And even in that, though, I think you're absolutely right. We came together as a world to develop vaccines, and once they're developed, the companies that developed them didn't share their intellectual property with the world. They said, no, we developed this, we're going to profit off it, where they could have just released it and said, no, this is a global public health crisis. We're going to release this and concentrate and let everyone have a chance to make this. And so, even there, I mean, I think not to sort of disagree with what you said.
No, I agree with
it's a both and.
That's a both and.
We've got a few more minutes. I think. No, go ahead.
I'm glad you broadened the discussion to the contemporary situation in which we talk about seeking a common good across cultural groupings. Your presentation was entirely on seeking the common good for a white colonist group in Massachusetts in the 17th century. Broadening your historical period, are there examples, pre-Revolutionary War, for example, in which there were persons seeking a common good that included Native Americans and the white settlers. I mentioned, for example, the Moravians in Pennsylvania and New York. And could you tell us about it?
So the Moravians are a great example. Thomas Morton, who I talked about, had this vision of coexisting with native peoples. There were, so it depends on how one sort of poses the question. So there are formal religious groups like the Moravians. Also, there's, starting in the late 17th, early 18th century is when you see the spread of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And so there are ministers who are going out to live among native peoples, right, with the idea of bringing them together. One of the great intellectual achievements, sort of the Puritans in some sense, is what's sometimes referred to as John Elliott's Indian Bible, in which they translate the Bible into what was then called Massachusetts, what's now known as Wampanoag, with an idea of creating a text that would facilitate cross-cultural communication on religious matters and presumably other matters. Because Europeans always believed that religious conversion was one part of living together. Natives had to change in other sorts of ways. But there are plenty of Europeans, especially those who do not live in the centers of population, who are living among native peoples, who form families with native peoples. It's far more common in New France than where the English went. And it's more common in places where the Spanish and the Portuguese went than where the English went. But certainly I would say that that Europeans who come over and become integrated into native societies, are a sign that, this cultural movement could go either way. There are a lot of religious texts, actually from the 18th and into the early 19th centuries, so-called captivity narratives, which are stories about people who've been taken captive by natives, and some of whom resist coming home. So I would say more on the individual level. So the Moravians in the 18th century are a relatively small group, and they're in a colony in Pennsylvania especially, which is more tolerant and open to Europeans and natives living together than most of the other colonies were. And it has a different history with native peoples. But it's not like you couldn't find them, but they would tend to be smaller. And it's important for us, the problem of being a historian of my period is that virtually all the documents I have come from one side of this cultural encounter. Because it's very important for us to realize that there are native peoples who are also very eager to work with and live with Europeans and create other kinds of communities. And one of the things that gets forgotten is even when you get to the Revolution, before the Revolution, there are native peoples living in all these colonial towns and cities. They're coming in and out regularly. So there's much more going on than our sort of stereotype of they're always separate.
Thank you. We expanded this from 45 minutes to an hour, and we're at an hour, and I feel like we could keep going. And are you able to sort of stick around for a few more minutes if people want to talk individually?
Absolutely, but I don't want to take them away from your
No. We're going to have to go up, and so feel free to stay here. And part of what I want to, again, reminding is we've got some discussion questions, and I'm going to leave them over here. And you're welcome to stay here. You can engage Peter. Can we just thank Peter, please? Thank him for his time. Thank you so much. Just really quickly, I'm going to read these questions, and we're also going to post them online. The first is really kind of bringing it home to you. What messages did you get from your family of origin, school, and faith community, if any, when you were growing up about community, our responsibility or lack of for each other, and the balance between working for the common good and personal gain? And then also, how have those messages changed as you have gotten older? Second, the Puritans thought that this land's indigenous people dying was all a part of God's plan. Thomas Morton, who you talked about, talks about this newfound Golgotha and that we are together in suffering, not them suffering and us benefiting. Where do you see both streams of thought active today within America and in our nation's relationships with the rest of the world? And then the third one is looking forward to next week. Next week we'll be looking at health. What does the word health mean to you? Is it something active and positive, or is it the absence of illness and other negative things? How can you tell if you are healthy? So we're going to leave some of these up here and some of these there. We're going to post them online. Encourage you, you can stick around here and start to have these be springboards for your conversations. Encourage you to take them home. And we'll see you back here next week with Dr. Linda James Myers from Ohio State and some other folks to kind of dive into health, and then we'll be off to the races. So thank you all very much. Thank you.